the angels as they're singing on the morning of his birth. But how much greater will our song be when he comes again, when he comes again.
Friends, and welcome to Bible Live, a ministry of the South Penn Church of Christ right here in Oklahoma City, where the gospel of Christ comes to life through a study of God's holy word. Thanks for joining us this evening. We were going to have an assembly this evening at church and hear the material that you're about to hear presented, but bad weather and bad roads kept us from doing that. So we're going to present it tonight online so that we don't lose track of our schedule. And Jonathan is going to present for us a study from our hard sayings of Jesus this evening. So Jonathan, with nothing further, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to present.
All right. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 24, and in particular the destruction of Jerusalem and all the things Jesus said about the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 this month. I was supposed to speak last week, and we pushed everything back, and we just couldn't do it 2 weeks in a row. So we'll start this discussion tonight, and then over the next 3 weeks, we'll have other lessons about what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24. So Joe Ritchell and Lucas Foreman will be talking about the abomination of desolation, and David Minson will be talking about the timing of these things, in particular the verse where Jesus says, but of that hour, no one knows, not even the Son. And so he'll be talking about that on the first Wednesday night in March. But tonight we're going to be looking at the question the disciples asked Jesus at the start of Matthew 24, and we're going to be looking at the chapter from a high level. A few things we can say before we get started. This is often referred to as the Olivet Discourse. So you will hear me use that phrase, and the reason it's called the Olivet Discourse, as we'll see in a minute, is because this is given on the Mount of Olives. So Jesus is in Matthew chapter 24 addressing the disciples from the Mount of Olives as they look into the temple. What I'd like to do, I am going to stop sharing right now, because I would like to read with you Matthew chapter 24. We're just going to read the entire chapter, and this will take a moment, but I think it is incredibly worthwhile as we get into this text. We may not read the very end of the chapter, but we will read most of Matthew chapter 24. In fact, we're going to back up just a little bit into chapter 23. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Matthew chapter 23. We'll start in verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Chapter 24. Jesus left the temple and was going away. When his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, he answered them, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered them, See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation, and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. Two women grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake. You do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And we'll stop right there. That captures the bulk of the Olivet Discourse that people fight about. The Olivet Discourse actually continues on into subsequent verses and chapters, into chapter 25 through the telling of three parables. And the parables generally aren't thought about as being part of the Olivet Discourse, but they are, and we'll see why they're important. I think they're often overlooked. All right, let's get some context to what's going on here. So Jesus this is in the last week of Jesus' life. This is a model replica of Herod's temple with a large courtyard. And Jesus has been spending a lot of his time in the temple complex during the last week of his life before he's crucified. And one day as he's leaving, he would leave through on the bottom portion of the screen, you can see a gate and a little road that comes out. It crosses the brook Kidron. And on the other side of the brook, which would be to the bottom of the screen, off the screen towards the bottom, would be that brook, and then the Mount of Olives. This would be the east side of the temple. And so as they're leaving, the disciples say, this temple is amazing. Look at the architecture and all the stones. And Jesus says, I tell you, not one stone will be left on the other. This whole thing is getting torn down. And when they're on the Mount of Olives, they ask him the question. They say, when will these things be? So Jesus says that this temple is going to be destroyed. They say, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? That's the question that they ask. Now, to give the outline of our study this evening, there are three things I want to consider. Number one, what question did the apostles ask? And you might be thinking, well, obviously you just said what their question was, but it's not quite that simple. And I think a lot of confusion comes from us not properly understanding the question as they asked it. We want to understand it as we hear it in the modern context, but not how they asked it. The second is, what are the themes of Jesus' answer? He comes to some recurring themes that are really important for us to think about. And I think sometimes we get stuck in the details. We miss some of the big picture. And third, I'm going to offer what is my outline of Matthew chapter 24. It's going to be debated. Different people have different outlines, all well-meaning. But we'll see how I look at Matthew 24. All right, here's the question. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? You might think that's 3 questions, but it's actually unclear. There are 3 views about how we should read this. The obvious view is that these are 3 distinct questions. So Jesus tell us, when will these things be? That is, when will the destruction of this temple complex be that you just mentioned? What will be the sign of your coming? And the third question is, and when will the end of the age be? So 3 distinct questions. That's one view. There's another view that says, well, really it's 2 questions. Number 1 is, when will these things be? And then the second question is a 2-parter. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? But I want to suggest that both of those are incorrect. That is not what the disciples asked. They asked in their minds, they asked one question. Now, Jesus is going to answer the different components to their question, but in their mind, they thought they were asking one question. And I'm going to lay out the argument for why that is, because I think that unlocks a lot of what goes on in Matthew 24. And it makes Jesus' response, I believe, make a lot more sense than just him cutting between. He's talking about the end of time over here, and he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem over there, and we're having to weave it out like a very complicated ball of yarn. I think it's one misguided question the disciples are asking. And here's why I think that's the case. Well, first of all, in Mark and in Luke, they just ask this question. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? So in Matthew, where he says the sign of your coming, in Mark, he says the sign of these things. That's one question. They thought they were asking, what will be the sign of these things, this destruction of the temple? So I think you look at Mark and Luke, they're asking one question. And so you look at Matthew, it makes sense that in their mind, this is one question. But the second reason I think this is, to me, it's really beyond doubt. It's obviously one question, I think, when you look at the history of this, is because of verse 8. And there's a lot that is meant in verse 8 of Matthew 24 when Jesus says, all these are but the beginning of birth pains. That is not a throwaway line. That's a very pointed remark that clued them into something that they believed about the coming of the Messiah. And so what does he mean when he calls these the beginning of birth pains? And what does this have to do with their question? Well, let's go look at the Jewish writings, because they wrote about this quite extensively in the Sanhedrin Talmud. The Jews believed in something called the birth pains of the Messiah. And the birth pains of the Messiah, they believed, would be in a period of intense oppression of Israel that would happen right before the coming of the Messiah, and then therefore the end of the age. They thought that there would be a period of intense oppression, persecution, and then the Messiah would come and deliver them from this oppression from the Romans, as we'll see in a moment as we read the quote, and then that's the end. That's the end of the age. The Messiah comes and we live happily ever after. So if that's the view of the apostles and of most Jews of the time, when they say, when will these things be, the destruction of this temple, the persecution, the birth pains of the Messiah, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, in their mind, that's one thing. The typical Jewish view is that there would be a period of intense oppression followed by the coming of the Messiah, and that's the end. So to illustrate that, this is a quote from the Sanhedrin Talmud. The son of David will not come until the evil Roman kingdom will disperse throughout Eretz Yisrael. Eretz is the Hebrew word for land, so the land of Israel, for 9 months. As it is stated, therefore, this is a quote from Micah chapter 5. Therefore will he give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return with the children of Israel. This is continuing the quote. Once a period equivalent to a term of pregnancy passes, the redemption will come. So let's stop right there. They believed that the Romans would occupy and control and devastate Israel for 9 months, the period of labor, 9 months. And then after that, the son of David will come and defeat the Romans. But they said this period of 9 months will be like the land is giving birth. It's intense pain. And so the Messiah only comes after the birth pains of the Messiah. And so going on in the Sanhedrin Talmud, they write, it's a different rabbi speaking, but he writes this. He says, let the Messiah come, but after my death, so that I will not see him, as I fear the suffering that will precede his coming. And there's several other quotations to this effect of the Messiah is going to come. I'd love to see the Messiah, but I know, according to Micah, it's going to be a period of intense labor and oppression and tribulation before the Messiah comes. So I would rather die now and not see the Messiah than have to live through the birth pains of the Messiah. That was a view of some of the rabbis. Not all rabbis agreed with that, but that was the view. So with that in mind, with the well-established viewpoint of the rabbis that the Messiah is only going to come after the period of great tribulation, and then that's the end of the age, read the question again. Tell us, when will these things be? That is, when will the temple be leveled? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? That's one question. And to me, once you put your mind in, once you have the ears of a first century Jew, they thought they were asking one question. Now Jesus is going to untangle their very tangled up question, because we know on this side of the resurrection that that question is not a valid question, that there is a delay between the fall of Jerusalem and the coming of the Son of Man and of the end of the age. Those things are not immediately preceding one to the next as they thought. Let's look at Micah 5. Why would they have come to this conclusion? Well, this was the text that they quoted, that the rabbis quoted in the Sanhedrin Talmud. Micah 5, 1-5. Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. Well, that's pretty bad. So troops, siege laid against the city. What does that sound like? Destruction of Jerusalem through some future army. That's the read they have of this. But here, right after that, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. So siege against the city, and then coming of the Messiah, born from Bethlehem, son of David. I mean, we read Micah 5:2 all the time with regard to a prophecy of the Messiah. It is a prophecy of the Messiah. Then going forward, therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he, the Messiah, shall be their peace. All right. They read this and said, it's pretty clear. There's a period of labor. They interpreted that literally and not metaphorically. So they said 9 months of intense tribulation, then the Messiah comes, and he will be the peace. That's the end of the age. That's their reading of Micah 5. That is why when Jesus says this city, this temple is going to be destroyed, they thought that's the end of the age. You're telling us the end of the age is nigh, and the coming of the Son of Man, the ultimate appearing of the Messiah is nigh. And that's what they're asking. And Jesus is going to correct that in this chapter. Now, you might be thinking, well, how could the disciples get it so wrong? Like, why would they be asking a question that is so obviously not true, or it's misguided at the very least? And I would remind us that in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, after the resurrection and right before the ascension of Jesus, the disciples asked Jesus, so when they had come together, they asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Like, we're kind of waiting for the Messiah to be our peace and for Israel to vanquish her enemies. Even in Acts chapter 1, this is obviously before Pentecost and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, when the mission of the church becomes clear to the apostles. But even in Acts chapter 1, it appears that they still had all of this tangled up in their minds. Remember, Jesus, at this point, they didn't even believe that Jesus was going to be crucified and resurrected. And we're just a few days before Passover in Matthew 24. Jesus told them, I'm going to Jerusalem, I will be crucified, and 3 days I will rise again. And the Bible is very clear that they did not understand that. So I don't think we should give the apostles too much credit for asking a very informed question about eschatology. They're not asking an informed question about eschatology. They're asking a question that would have been typical of Jews of their day. When is this going to be? And what would be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? One question. All right. So that's number one. Let's understand the question. I believe it is one question, not three questions. I think that's first of all. Jesus is going to spend his time in the chapter untangling a very tangled up question. So what are some of the major themes? And once you, I think, unlock this, it helps explain what they got wrong in the question. All right. After Jesus gives the Olivet Discourse, we read through it. After he gives the Olivet Discourse, he gives three parables, and all of them have the same theme, and that's the theme of delay. So in Matthew 24, right after our reading concluded, but if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed. In Matthew 25:5, in the parable of the foolish virgins, as the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. Matthew 25:19, in the parable of the talents. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. What? Well, are we talking about a delay? What does a delay have to do with their question? Remember, the parables are a part of the Olivet Discourse. We don't often include them, but we ought to. They're connected. Jesus told them parables to inform and explain what he's describing in chapter 24. Well, the answer to me is that they thought this was one question. The temple is going to be destroyed, and that's the end of the end of the age is imminent, right? Temple's destroyed, Messiah comes, defeats the Romans, that's the end. Jesus says, what if the son is delayed? What if he goes away? What if the bridegroom is delayed? What if the master of the kingdom goes away for a long time? And of course, the moral emphasis out of those parables is Jesus may be delayed in his return, but we need to be ready. We need to be ready for his coming, as he says in Matthew 24. So why would Jesus tell 3 parables about a delay? What does that have to do with the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, it's everything once we understand that they are asking a wrong-headed question. Jesus is saying, yes, these things will be within your lifetime, but the sign of my coming and of the end of the age, you need to expect that there might be a delay with regard to that. That to me is a pretty important point to make. Jesus emphasized the delay in the Olivet parables. Second, we have to follow the words. And there is a phrase that occurs with great density in Matthew 23 and 24, and that's the phrase, these things. The what do they call the near demonstrative pronoun? These things. And it occurs in Matthew 23:36. I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. In Matthew 24, when the disciples asked the question, you see all these things, Jesus says, it's the same Greek word. The translators don't put the word things there, but it's the same word. You see all these things, I say to you, there will not be one stone left upon another. And then they ask him, when will these things be? So these things in Matthew 24 and in Matthew 23 relate to the temple. These things, they're sitting there looking at the temple. I can imagine Jesus gesturing with his hands. Do you see all these things? It's going to be torn down. And they say, well, when will these things be? Now, the phrase these things is occurring with density here. And so we need to not think this is a throwaway line. This matters because he keeps using it. In chapter 24, verse 8, all these things, destruction of Jerusalem, are but the beginning of birth pains. Matthew 24:32 through 34, from the lesson of the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, just like he said in verse 8, all these things, just like he said earlier in the chapter, just like he said in chapter 23, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. He says, this generation will not pass away, just like he said in chapter 23, until all these things take place. Whenever you're breaking down a complicated text, follow the words. Jesus is cluing us in. All these things. The destruction of Jerusalem, these things that they're looking at the temple, he's gesturing with his hands, you can imagine. All these things will take place within this generation. Now, if you follow the phrase these things, it becomes pretty clear that it connects particularly to their question. Tell us when these things will be. He says these things will be in your lifetime. So it's coming soon. So follow the words. All right. As we wrap up, how does this come into an outline? So I believe, the view I take of Matthew 24 is that the disciples asked one very misguided question and that Jesus untangles their very tangled up question. They thought the destruction of Jerusalem would happen and immediately thereafter the Messiah would come and that would be the end of the age. That's what they believed. That's what, and don't fault them. That's what other Jews believed, as we read from the Sanhedrin Talmud. Jesus untangles that question in his answer by saying these things are going to happen in your life, but there are some things that won't. And a big part of Matthew 24 is the untangling of that tangled up question. So with that in mind, here's how the outline works. Verses 1 through 3 is the question that Jesus is answering, that they pose. The second part, verses 4 through 14, are what Jesus calls as the tribulations that must take place. Now, there is debate among Bible-believing, sincere Christians about how we should read those 11 verses. Is that specific to the events immediately before the fall of Jerusalem, or are those typical of events that was true for that generation that would also be true for all generations? There's debate among amillennial, soft preterists, and if you know those phrases, I say that to say there are Christians on both sides of that have disagreements, that are not taking fanciful views of Matthew 24. So unclear about those 11 verses. Maybe one of the later speakers will flush all that out for us. But it is clear that verses 15 through 22 are the tribulations that immediately precede and include the fall of Jerusalem. if those days are intense, but for the sake of the elect, they're cut off. He is talking about the fall of Jerusalem in verses 15 through 22. So these things, fall of Jerusalem, he gives them the expectation, the signs of how that's going to be in verses 15 through 22. But in verse 23, the Son of Man does not come at this time. That's important. They're going to say, look, the Son of Man's there. He's on the roof. No, he's down in the room. The Son of Man's here. He's there. He's everywhere. Jesus says, don't believe him. Now, remember, the question is, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, of the coming of the Son of Man? Well, he says, here's the sign of all these things, the fall of Jerusalem. But that is not when the Son of Man comes. Don't believe them if they tell you it is. That's what he's saying in verses 23 through 28. And then verses 29 through 31, again, Christians disagree about how to interpret this, but he describes in some language the coming of the Son of Man. Some say that's metaphorical for the fall of Jerusalem. Some say no, that it's way too close to Matthew 13, which is clearly about the literal second coming of Jesus. There's debate about that. But I think without debate are the next 2 points I have. He gives them the signs discerning Jerusalem's fall. Learn the lesson from the fig tree. You see the seasons, you know what's coming. All these things are going to happen in your generation. And he gives them the signs of the fall of Jerusalem. But then he says in verse 36, no signs will precede the coming of the Son of Man. So you see the distinctions here? The tribulation that surrounds the fall of Jerusalem is coming, but the Messiah does not come at that time. You'll see all the signs associated with the fall of Jerusalem, but you will not see any signs. It's like lightning flashing across the sky. You don't know when it's going to happen when the Son of Man makes his ultimate return. And then he gets into 3 parables that talk about the delay of the return of the Son of Man. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll bring this to a close. There's a lot of different views on Matthew 24, and this is just my view. You don't have to agree with me. I may not agree with myself in 5 years, and I certainly don't agree with myself 5 years ago. But someone made a point. I believe it was in our hard sayings lesson. And I think it was on the text about the guardian angel, or the believed guardian angel of children. And the speaker made a point that, we're getting into these hard sayings and we're thinking like, well, what's the real point? Like, why are we, having a study about these esoteric meanings and what could they mean and how should we interpret them? And one of the points the speaker pointed out is that often our spiritual growth happens in the study of the subject itself, not in the conclusion. You read Matthew 24 and you think about how God is working in history, how his plans are unfolding throughout time, and how the Messiah is present, and how he's going to come again, and how everything that Daniel prophesied was being fulfilled. All of this is coming in Micah 5, all these prophecies. You study that, you're going to grow as a Christian through the process of study. So my encouragement is, when we come to a difficult text like Matthew 24, let's study it, let's read it, let's do our best to understand it, let's pray over it, and we will mature as Christians in the study of it, even if the 2 different people have slightly different takes on this. I will say, I don't think there are 2 people that I know of that have the exact same view of Matthew 24. There's always a slight detail. Well, maybe this line relates to the destruction of Jerusalem, and this line relates to the second coming. And those are all great discussions to have, but I don't want to be lost in the fact that we might disagree. I want to spend time sincerely studying this and growing as a process, as a part of that process.
Thank you, Jonathan. A really, really good study, and I think you're onto some very key threads in understanding the book of Matthew, chapter 24. Looking forward to the other studies that will come. Friends, thanks for joining us this evening. This will broadcast this evening on Wednesday night. We hope you enjoy it. I hope to see you Sunday morning at our next service. Until then, God bless.